Hello everybody and welcome back to another brand new video where today I'm continuing this series of videos that I'm doing looking back at series 1 of Doctor Who 15 years on. Of course today it is the 9th of April 2020, which marks exactly 15 years to the day since episode 3 of series 1, The Unquiet Dead, first aired. And so, as well done with the previous two videos, this is a kind of a review, but also just a general sort of discussion around the context of that episode at the time, how it was perceived, some of the viewing figures, just a look at generally about everything around this episode that aired, as I say, 15 years ago today. So after we'd had the first two episodes, which had been pretty well received generally, I think it's fair to say, with Rose kind of setting up what Doctor Who is as a programme, having it set present day Earth, introducing the Doctor and the companion of Rose. Then we went to the End of the World, which is a far future Doctor Who story set on a sort of satellite space station at the end of the world, hence the title. And then in this episode, to kind of complete that trio of exploring all the different things Doctor Who can do, we go back to a story set in the past for the first time in New Doctor Who. Now, of course, this was a fairly common feature in the classic series. There were many an episode set in the past, particularly in the very, very early days, back when there was what were called pure historicals, which didn't feature any sort of alien threat at all, and it was purely a historical figure usually, or historical setting for a story. With New Who, we've always seen some sort of alien aspect within historical stories, just because it adds that little extra element to keep it exciting and interesting and making sure it's proper Doctor Who sci-fi story. And this is also, we see the first of the, what I guess are kind of dubbed celebrity historical stories, as it introduces Charles Dickens as a character in this story, of course the very famous writer, and he's one of the central characters behind this story, and it's a sort of a formula or a template that's used fairly often, particularly more in New Who than in the classic series, although very occasionally you met famous people like Marco Polo, but more generally it's been used in the new series, where obviously in this episode we meet Charles Dickens. And it's always a good opportunity to throw in a few sort of references and iconic moments towards Charles Dickens' work in an episode like this, or there's different things he sort of wrote back then, and seeing the Doctor be a fanatical fan of Charles Dickens is also quite an entertaining moment, with lots of sort of references and nods to his works there, I think, which is always quite entertaining to watch. And it's worth noting this was the first script from Mark Gatiss, who became very much a stalwart writer of Doctor Who right up until 2017, with his last episode, Empress of Mars. I think he wrote around 10 episodes of Doctor Who in total, plus an adventure in space and time back in 2013 for the 50th anniversary special. And I think it's fair to say this is one of his stronger outings. I know Mark Gatiss has never really particularly had the highest rated episodes, I think it's fair to say, and often they haven't personally been favourites of mine, but I think The Unquiet Dead is definitely one of his best stories. I think watching this episode, one of the things that strikes me is how kind of dark the ideas behind this story actually are. We're looking at kind of demon possession of the dead and stuff around seances and talking to people beyond the grave, or well, to other worlds with the Gelth. It's some very, very dark and creepy ideas. Seeing dead people come out of coffins, being possessed and walking around, is something for a sort of children/family show that Doctor Who was, I think, quite a bold stance to take in just episode 3 of your brand new series, to go straight down this quite dark, almost horror type story. It just really struck me how bold that was, given that in the classic series I really don't think they would have gone anywhere near anything like that. Certainly I do think it creates quite a good and quite an interesting story. It very much, as I say, has all the very creepy elements to it. I think the Gelth are a reasonably interesting sort of alien threat that are seemingly just people who've been kind of lost their home planet and their world in the Time War and their physical form, and just want to come and inhabit a few dead people to kind of save their race. But then it turns out that there's absolutely millions of them, and all they want to do is actually just take over the Earth and destroy everybody, basically. So to an extent, your classic alien invasion plotline in the end, but it was quite a nice twist that it didn't seem like that's what it was going to be, and then as soon as they open the rift, let them in, that's what it actually turns out to be, and it nearly kills everybody. Looking at the production side of the story, a few interesting things to note, I think, is that this story is probably the first Doctor Who story ever that heavily kind of requires CGI in it. Of course, there were very early versions of that through CSO back in the sort of 70s and 80s of Doctor Who. They tried to do sort of special effect things like that, but I think this story is the first most sort of striking use and most extensive use of CGI effects, when the monster is purely CGI throughout this whole story, the Gelth. That is all they are, and I think that's a very interesting thing, and I think it still actually looks pretty good, given that it's 15 years old now. Well, they probably were working on it in 2004, quite frankly, so 16 years we're talking about. The fact that it still looks pretty impressive, I think, is really a testament to how much effort was was put in by the Mills CGI effects guys way back then in 2004/5, I really am able to buy into them as an alien threat because the CGI itself works so effectively. And something that I like to talk about a little bit is the music in the story, and it was noticeable, I think, in the first half in particular, that there was a real lack of any music. Given that the first 2 episodes are so heavily dominated, there's barely 30 seconds that goes past without some music slotted in there. Whereas in this story, in the first half, certainly in the first half of the story, it feels like there's a large swathe, several minutes, where there's no music at all and it's just the dialogue. And with the Gelth, they very much use the sound effects of sort of them swirling around and screams and stuff rather than any actual music, which I think works quite effectively. It just doesn't go too overboard like we saw in the first 2 episodes a little bit. But there definitely is still the same problems with the music being mixed way too high and way too loud in some particular scenes where the dialogue is being way overpowered by the music and it's just poorly mixed. I'm not going to talk about this in every video. I just thought it was noticeable once again in this story that it was a little bit of a problem. It was notable at the time after the significant drop in viewing figures between episodes 1 and 2. I think it dropped around 2.5 to 3 million viewers between those first 2 episodes. For this episode, it actually almost gained 1 million viewers back again. It went, I think, from just under 8 million to just under 9 million, which is obviously figures we can only dream of now, quite frankly, but shows that the kind of popularity was already kind of fluctuating up and down a bit. And this, as I say, the story did just seem to, I honestly don't know why. Maybe it was just what was on TV, what the weather was like at that time. It's really impossible to know 15 years on, but it is just notable that the figures shot up by nearly 1 million again for this episode. And so it showed after just 3 episodes that Doctor Who was still already maintaining a very solid audience and viewership of 6, 7, 8 million every single week, which is was a very strong figure at the time, and I think to an extent unexpected, but showed that there really was an appetite and a popularity and an interest in this new one, the return of this age-old sci-fi show of Doctor Who. I think looking back at the episode, one of the kind of notable things from the first 2 episodes is the relationship and the development of the Doctor and Rose's relationship that really, it feels like, is very much a focal point of episodes 1 and 2. Whereas in this 3rd episode, The Unquiet Dead, it feels a little bit left on the back burner a bit more. There's a few moments between them, some nice moments, some controversial moments when the Doctor's explaining how the sort of, well, we have organ donors, so they're people walking around with organs from people who are dead. Why is it different to walking around as dead people? And basically just saying, if you don't like it, go home. It was a pretty brutal moment from the Doctor, the sort of thing I expect from early Peter Capaldi Doctor. I kind of forgot that we got a bit of that in the 9th Doctor as well. It was very noticeable, I think, in that moment. And so, yeah, there were sort of unsubtle moments like that in this episode, but it felt like as a whole, the plot was a lot more focused on maybe in this story than what we'd seen in the last 2, where it was very much about the character relationships. And that's probably partially down to the fact that the first 2 were written by Russell T Davies and this one was written by Mark Gatiss, and so he would have had less kind of insight and connection to the characters in the same way that Russell was when he was the one creating the characters, that naturally I think the plot was always going to take more precedent in a story like this. And it did give us another little reference to the Bad Wolf when we hear Gwyneth, played by Eve Miles, of course, who would become famous in Torchwood in the coming years. But in this story, she references the big bad wolf when sort of seeing into Rose, into the future. And so just giving us another immediate hint at what at this mysterious bad wolf, what is it all about? What could it be? What connection has it seemingly got to Rose at this point? It's all just great that we get these first little references into there. A few more references to the Time War as well, with the Gelth and finding out that they've sort of been lost their planet and their form from the Time War, and also the first mention of the rift in time and space in Cardiff. This mysterious sort of open hole, this open wound in time and space that's opened up inside Cardiff, which is then heavily explored later in the series, particularly in Boomtown as well, which is just another notable thing. It's just great to see this real serialization by Russell, where there's just so many things that are dropped in each of these episodes that are then picked up later in the series that all come back and connect together. It just seems to be like it's such a tight-knit and closely interconnected series. Even though each story is so individual in its plot and storyline in the most parts, there's still so many linking elements that I think it just creates such a perfect series as we go through the rest of it, of course. So yes, The Unquiet Dead probably isn't one of Doctor Who's all-time classics. I don't think anybody would say that. I mean, I think that none of these first 3 episodes are really all-time classics in terms of the pure story. The nostalgia factor is, of course, pushes up Rose, and I think The End of the World as well. The Unquiet Dead is a pretty solid historical story that kind of introduces that aspect of Doctor Who back into the show and being able to travel into the past. The idea of a celebrity historical is more introduced into this story as well. And it maintained its viewership and helped to sort of continue the story of the series, really. So there are a lot of positive aspects topics around this, even if it's not an all-time classic. But I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on episode 3 of The Unquiet Dead, and anything, any little tidbits or facts or info you've got around it as well. I always love to hear them and read them, so do put them in the comments down below. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I'll be back again this time next week to have a look back at Aliens of London, the first two-parter in New Who, something to look forward to with episode 1 of that. So do join me then for that. But as always, guys, hit that like button, that subscribe button if you're new here, and I'll see you again then for a brand new video. Goodbye.